So we have completed the 6 wedges for the dishcloth, and your knitting would look somewhat like that from the inside. Now to close the circle, we are going to do the Kitchener stitch. For the Kitchener stitch, you're going to need 2 knitting needles. I have chosen 2 double pointed needles. Now we won't be knitting with them. We would just be using them to hold the stitches so that we can join the 2 sides together. So go ahead and find some knitting needles that will work with the loom and the yarn that you're using. I will be using size number 3. If you're using a large gauge loom, you probably be best using size 8 needles. Or if you're using an extra fine gauge loom, you'll probably be best using size 1 or size 0 knitting needles. Let's get started. To begin the grafting process, go to the last stitch that is currently on the loom and take the stitch off the loom with your knitting tool and place that stitch on your knitting needle. Now do the same with the next stitch and the next one, and continue in this manner until you have reached the first stitch. All your stitches should be off the loom and on one of the knitting needles. So I have taken the entire row of stitches off the loom and now they are on the knitting needle. Here they are. Okay, so now take your knitting loom away and put it on the side. We won't be using it anymore. Now we're going to pick up the stitches from the cast on row. That was the very first row that you knitted. So over here you have the last row already on the knitting needle, and now we're going to pick up the stitches from the very first row. So go ahead and pick up the loops. The loops from my first row are really discernible, so just go ahead and insert the loops onto the knitting needle. So let's begin picking up the stitches from the cast on row. So let's begin on this end, one, the next one, the next one, next one, you should have the same number of stitches that you cast it on. So if you cast it on 17, be sure to pick up 17 loops. If you cast it on more for a bigger pinwheel or less for a smaller pinwheel, pick up that many stitches. So here we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, so we need one more. There it is. So we have 17 stitches on that knitting needle and 17 stitches on the first knitting needle. So let's go ahead and begin our grafting or Kitchener stitch. Slide the stitches to one of the ends of the knitting needles so you have both together. Go ahead and cut your working yarn and leave a long tail. Thread a tapestry needle through the end, and you will be working with the tapestry needle to close the sides together. So let's go over the setup for the Kitchener. The setup simply joins the front piece towards the back. And the setup says to go through the front as if to purl and leave the stitch on the needle. So when it says to purl, simply go from the right towards the left by inserting your tapestry needle through the stitch like so. That's when as if to purl. And now go to the back as if to knit and leave the stitch on the needle. So we go towards the back, and when it says to knit, as if to knit, you go from left to right through the stitch. So you pull the yarn through, and you do not take the stitches off the needles. The stitches stay on the needles. And now we're ready to begin the steps number 1 through 4 of the Kitchener stitch. Step number 1 says, to the front as if to knit and off. So we go through the front as if to knit, from left to right, and we take the stitch off. Step number 2 says to go through the front as if to purl and leave the stitch on the needle. So through the front as if to purl, leave the stitch on the needle, and simply pull the working yarn, making sure that it stays correctly. And now step number 3 says to go through the back so you go to the back needle as if to purl and take the stitch off. So through the back as if to purl, take the stitch off. Step number 4 says to go through the back as if to knit and pull the yarn through and leave that stitch on the needle. So there we go. And now we're ready to repeat step number 1 through 4 of the Kitchener stitch. So again, we go through the front as if to knit and off, through the front as if to purl and leave it on, through the back as if to purl and take it off, through the back as if to knit and leave it on. Continue repeating these 4 steps 1 through 4 of the Kitchener stitch. When you reach the last stitch, just continue, purl off, knit on, knit off, and the last one on the back, purl, and take the knitting needles off. Now with your working yarn, simply pass the yarn past the tapestry needle through those center stitches if you have a hole. With the ends and your dishcloth or blanket, whatever you decided to use the pinwheel design for, it's ready. Make sure that you wet block your pinwheel. I like to use steam. Simply wet your pinwheel and then get this steam iron and go over it, and your pinwheel should lay pretty flat. And after it is blocked, you can see that it does go into a circle. So that was knitting pinwheels on a knitting loom. Thanks for visiting us here at DALooms.com.